Hey, everybody. What you're hearing now is a reconstruction of a teaching I did on Chanukah for the first night of Chanukah. Many people asked for a recording of the session, and instead of just putting a Zoom cast up, I thought I'd repeat the teaching here. In teaching about Hanukkah, or any Jewish holiday, it's always well to look at in 4 dimensions. The first dimension being the historical. The second dimension is the ritual, how we actually observe the holiday. The third dimension is the symbolic, meaning looking at the observance, looking at the history, and seeing what the symbols mean, what values are embedded in the symbols. And then the fourth dimension is transformative, meaning how do we actually use all of this for personal transformation? So the idea that the study of the holidays leads to personal transformation is more or less a Hasidic idea, meaning we're looking for the inner life dimension of our holidays. Certainly we pay attention to the historical, we pay attention to the ritual. The symbolic and the mythic narrative are very important, crucial to the inner life tradition. But ultimately, in the Hasidic tradition, it has to make a difference to our inner lives. So we're going to go through these one by one. Now, from an historical perspective, let's pull the lens back and look at Chanukah as part of the history of Hellenistic Syria. When Alexander the Great died, he divided his kingdom into 3. One part of the kingdom had its capital in Damascus. And in general, the Syrian Hellenists, like the Persians before them, had allowed the different ethnic groups to keep their traditions. There's a certain point when Antiochus IV came to power, and we're going to say this is about 170 or so BCE. Antiochus IV wanted greater homogeneity in his kingdom. And there were many Judeans who also wanted to be a more integrated part of the Syrian Hellenistic Empire. They gave Antiochus IV the impression that Judea was willing to be merged into Syrian Hellenistic culture. And so, and then there were those who resisted the movement, the abandoning of the religion of the ancestors and being part of Syrian Hellenistic culture. So part of what we have is a struggle in Judea between what we'll call the traditionalists, those who wanted to keep the traditions of the ancestors, and those who wanted to merge with the Hellenists. The Judean Hellenists apparently reported to Antiochus IV that there were trouble with a few renegades who did not want to merge with the Syrian Hellenistic Empire. So he sent down soldiers to put down this insurrection, this rebellion. And in putting it down, for example, outlawing circumcision, outlawing the keeping of the Sabbath, the violence escalated until he decided to get rid of these traditionalists once and for all. Now, what are the sources for all of this? As you'll be seeing, 2 great sources are the books of the Maccabees, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, in a book called the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha is not canonical in Judaism. It is not canonical in the Protestant religions, Protestant denominations. It has been kept in the Catholic Bible. So one reason we have the books of Maccabees is because the Catholic Church preserved them all these years. Of course, one of our greatest historical resources is Josephus, who wrote a history of the Jews. Josephus was a Jewish general in the rebellion against the Romans and survived the war, and wrote a history of Jews and Judaism in Greek. Another incredibly important resource. We have other important resources. For example, it's called the Megillah, or the Scroll of Antiochus. So scholars have pored over these texts, and what we have now is a pretty reliable history of the period from roughly primary sources. Now, there are many books about this period. One important one is by Elias Bickerman, another one by Cherrycover, Martin Engel. So there are many, many different books written about this period, and it's not hard just to put in your browser history of the Maccabees, history of Judaism and Syrian Hellenism and so forth. And so what we have here is is a well-attested historical story. So now we have this conflict between the Jewish Hellenists and the traditional Judeans. Antiochus IV comes down on the side of the Judean Hellenists. He wants to put down the rebellion. And as he's putting down this rebellion, the traditionalists run into the wilderness, into the Midbar Yehuda, the wilderness of Judah. And the text described great desolation, a sense of that a catastrophe has been visited upon the people, that the tradition of the ancestors that we would call Judaism will not survive. And during this time when people were out in this great desolation, without food, without water, without heat, there's a family of the Hashmonaim, a priestly family that was not permitted to offer sacrifice in Jerusalem, but they were of priestly background nonetheless. And that family, the Hashmonaim, the Hasmoneans, they organized a rebellion. So it was Matityahu, the father, led the rebellion. He died and ultimately went down to his son, Judah the Hashmonaim, Judah the Hasmonean, who gained the nickname Yehuda Maccabi. The word Maccabah in Aramaic means hammer, probably from the word nokev, which is a pointed, refers to a pointed hammer. So a rebellion begins, and the people had almost no hope, no confidence that this rebellion could ever succeed. They engaged in a guerrilla warfare against the Syrian Hellenists. We see it described in detail in the books of the Maccabees, 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Eventually, the Syrian Hellenist armies withdrew. It wasn't as if the Maccabees conquered the Syrian Hellenist armies, but rather the war of attrition was just too much. They withdrew and actually agreed to let the Hashmonaim rule Judea. So the story of Chanukah, which is from the word lechanech, which means to dedicate, also means to educate. For example, when you put up a mezuzah in your home, it's called a Chanukat Bayit, a dedication of the home. So Chanukah means dedication around the idea that the Judeans were going to go into this defiled temple, clean it out, and dedicate it back to the worship of the one God. What we have in the book of Maccabees is the description of when the Judean forces entered into Jerusalem. So I'm going to first read from 2nd Maccabees, and this is 2nd Maccabees chapter 10, and then I'll read from 1st Maccabees chapter 4. So after the fighting, they went into the temple, they cleaned it up, they demolished the temple, the altars that were dedicated to pagan sacrifices. They offered a sacrifice for the first time in 2 years, restored the incense, the lights, the bread of the presence. And then it goes on to say, the sanctuary was purified on the 25th day of Kislev, which is the beginning of Chanukah, the same day of the same month on which the foreigners had profaned it. So it was the same day that it had been profaned by the Syrian Hellenists. The joyful celebration lasted for 8 days. Why 8 days? We're told. It was like the Feast of Tabernacles, for they recalled how, only a short time before, they had kept that feast while they were living like wild animals in the mountains and caves. And so they carried garlanded wands and branches with their fruits, as well as palm fronds, and they chanted hymns to the one who had so triumphantly achieved the purification of his own temple. A measure was passed by the public assembly to the effect that the entire Jewish people should keep these days every year. So you'll see that the 8 days of Hanukkah in the mind of the Maccabees was like a tabernacle celebration, the celebration of Sukkot. Now, what's going on there? Now, I'm relying on historical resources that tell us that originally the Maccabees wanted to rededicate the temple during Sukkot. Why is that? Because the first temple was dedicated during Sukkot in an 8-day celebration. And you'll see this in the book of 1 Kings. In the book of First Kings, there was a miracle where a light from God lit up the altar, the menorah, the fire offering. And they wanted that to happen as well. They wanted a supernatural sign from God that they had properly rededicated the temple. When they did this during Sukkot of 164 BCE, nothing happened. Because there was confusion about the calendar, they waited an entire other month. So let's say they went from October to November. They waited again for a miracle. Nothing happened. They waited a whole other month to the 15th of the Kislev. Nothing happened. So they let that entirely run out. They realized there was going to be no miracle. So on the 25th day of Kislev is when they rededicated the temple. So they didn't conquer the area on the 25th of Kislev. They dedicated it in an 8-day celebration like Sukkot. Now I'll go ahead and read to you from First Maccabees, describes it. It says here in chapter 4, Judah selected priests without blemish. They removed the unclean parts of the temple. I'm moving down, I'm summarizing 45, 46, etc. They reconstructed the altar, a pure altar to dedicate to God. They renewed the sacred vessels, the lampstand, the altar of incense, and the bread table. And then early on the 25th day of Kislev, a sacrifice was offered as the law commands. On the anniversary of the day that the Syrian Hellenists had profaned it, it was rededicated with hymns and thanksgiving, music of harps and lutes and cymbals, and the people prostrated and worshiped God. They celebrated the rededication of the altar for 8 days. There was great rejoicing as they brought offerings. They decorated the front of the temple with golden wreaths and ornamental shields. They renewed the gates and the priests' rooms. And then it says, there was great merrymaking among the people, and the disgrace brought upon them by the foreigners had been removed. Now I'm in chapter 4, verse 59. Then Judas and his brothers and the whole congregation decreed that the rededication of the altar should be observed with joy and gladness at the same season every year for 8 days, beginning with the 25th of Kislev. So from the historical perspective, we have Second Maccabees, we have First Maccabees, we have Josephus, many sources, but what's described is they went in after a bitter war, rededicated the temple to God. They celebrated for 8 days, roughly based on the holiday of Sukkot, which is a 7-day holiday, plus the 8th day, which is called Shmini Atzeret. So that's why we have 8 days of Hanukkah. Now, as far as from an historical perspective, you probably noticed I left out the so-called miracle of the oil. The so-called miracle of the oil is not mentioned in either book of the Maccabees, is not mentioned in Josephus, is understood to be completely ahistorical. It did not happen. So where is the first time we find a mentioning of this? Well, in our canonical tradition, it's in the Talmud. It's also in the Megillah of Antiochus, but it's not a well-known text. You can probably find it online. So I want to read to you what's written in the Talmud as to the history of Chanukah, understanding that no scholar, no historian believes that it is an historically credible tale. And our question, therefore, is why would the Talmud preserve this completely non-historical tradition? So this is in Tractate Shabbat, Tractate the Sabbath. It's on page 21. It's on the folio 21 on the backside, meaning page 2. It says, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught. There's a teaching about the oil and the wicks, and then it goes down to a little bit lower, my Chanukah. What exactly is Chanukah? Detanu Rabbanan, as the rabbis taught. On the 25th day of Kislev, Yomei de Chanukah Tamanya Inun. There are 8 days. And then it says we don't We don't give eulogies. We don't mourn during this time. It's a time of happiness and gladness. And then it tells us why. It says, Kishenichnesu Yevanim laheichal tim'u kol hashmanim shebeheichal. When the Syrian Hellenists went into the shrine, they defiled all of the oil to be used in the menorah, used in the light sacrifice. Gavra malchut behashmonai benitzchum. When the Hasmoneans were victorious over the Syrian Hellenists, badku v'lo matzu ele pach echad shel shemen shaya. They searched around and they only found one cruse or packet of oil that had the shaya munach b'chotamot shel kohen gadol, that had the seal of the high priest. V'lo haya bo ela l'hadlik yom echad. But there was not enough oil except to go for one day. Naaseh bo nes v'hidliku mimenu shmona yamim. A miracle occurred, they lit it, and it lasted for all 8 days. L'shana acheret kvaum v'asaum. And then for the next year and for all time, they established that there would be an 8-day Hanukkah celebration with Hallel and Hoda'ah, with praise and thanksgiving. So the question is, when we do the historical of the 4 parts of teaching the holiday, the historical part, why the rabbis wanted this story in the Talmud. The consensus is that the Judeans had fought a bitter war against the Romans called the Great Revolt between 67 and 70 CE, and then again 132 to 135 CE. The temple was destroyed. The Judeans were exiled, and there's utter devastation throughout Judea. There were people who lived in the area, survived, and they went up into the Galilee. But Jewish life in Judea came to an end more or less, with very, very few survivors. What did the Romans do beyond that? When they destroyed Jerusalem, when they destroyed the temple, they renamed Jerusalem to Aelia Capitolina. They went around and they renamed many cities. For example, the city of Shechem was later called Naples, or Nablus in Arabic. Judea was renamed Palestine. The Romans did that. And so there was an attempt by the Romans to completely destroy, erase any memory of the Judeans in what we'll call the land of Israel in Judea. Some people refer to as Palestine. So that's the historical background. Now it's interesting. So therefore, the rabbis did not want the Jewish people during Hanukkah to remember it as a time of military victory, fearing that people would believe that they could rebel against the Romans, enjoy yet another miracle, and God would help them defeat the Roman army. The rabbis did not want this to happen, so they took the emphasis off of the military victory and they created a miracle. We don't really know who wrote this. It's clearly, in my mind, not meant to be taken utterly seriously, especially since we have so much history of the period. But it's to get our mind off the military victory and onto something else that was more of a symbolic understanding of Hanukkah as opposed to an historical one. From the symbolic dimension of Hanukkah, by the way, number 3 in our discussion of history, ritual, and symbols, the miracle of the oil actually has great symbolic value. It's just not historical. Now, and Hanukkah is called a minor Jewish holiday. When did it start to be reborn in the Jewish tradition? With the establishment of the State of Israel. With the establishment of the State of Israel, the idea of a Jewish military fighting a war against those who wanted to destroy the Israelites became part of our culture. So in Israel, Hanukkah became a very important holiday, and it became a very important holiday in North America. It does have proximity to Christmas. I remember one time I read in the newspaper that Hanukkah was the Jewish Christmas celebration. There are reasons they're both on the 25th, one on the 25th of Kislev, one on the 25th of December. But there is really no connection whatsoever between the holidays. So it was a military victory, then a remembrance of the miracle of the oil, and now it's come back, especially in Israel and then outside of Israel, as commemorating a military victory again. Now, here's another interesting part of history, that when we look in the daily prayer book, that during Hanukkah there is a part of the prayers that is recited each day. I'll read it to you, and you'll notice how the prayer book comes down on whether it's a military victory or whether it's a miracle of oil. I'll read in the English. It says, in the days of Mattityahu, the son of Yochanan, the high priest, the Hasmonean, and his sons, when the wicked Greek kingdom rose up against your people Israel, this is a prayer to God, to make them forget your Torah and compel them to stray from the statutes of your will, you in your great mercy stood up for them in their time of distress. You took up their grievance, you judged their claim, you avenged their wrong. You delivered the strong into the hands of the weak, the many into the hands of the few, the impure into the hands of the pure, the wicked into the hands of the righteous, the wanton into the hands of the diligent students of your Torah. You made a great and holy name for yourself in the world and for your people Israel. You worked a great victory and salvation on this very day. Thereafter, your children came to the Holy of Holies in your house, cleansed your temple, purified the site of your holiness, and kindled lights in the courtyards of your sanctuary, and they established these 8 days of Hanukkah to express thanks and praise to your name. Now notice, the prayer book makes no mention of the miracle of the oil of Hanukkah. So how do we assume that Hanukkah was celebrated back in those days? We assumed that the descriptions that we have in the book of Maccabees were pretty accurate, meaning it was a celebration outdoors, parades with torches, with garlands, a great merry party, as the book of Maccabees says. And by the way, that's what happens in Israel today. If you go to Israel during the time of Hanukkah, you'll see huge gatherings of young people singing, dancing, saying the prayers. So you'll see in Israel today, in just about every large city, you'll see what happened back in Maccabean times. So that's the historical background. How do we celebrate Hanukkah? Well, we're taught in our tradition that the minimal celebration is one candle in your doorway. Where in your doorway? As you're facing your door, the mezuzah is on your right, the candle is on your left, you're standing in the middle. You light the candle in your doorway. Why in the doorway? They say, lefirsume nisa, to publicize the miracle. Now, after a while, they brought the observance into the home, probably because they didn't want to rile up the anti-Semites. That's what historians say. We don't know exactly why. And then we have the holiday of not lighting one candle per night, but either 8 down to 1, 1 up to 8. That's called a custom for the mehadrim, for those especially punctilious about keeping the commandments. And there's two different ideas. One is, since the pach shemen, the cruse of oil, had enough power to last for 8 days, and as each day went by, you might say the power diminished. This is the school of Shammai. They say light 8 candles, and then each succeeding day you go down to 1 candle. So it's 8 down to 1. The school of Hillel said you never diminish holiness, and therefore you go 1 up to 8. Beit Shammai, 8 down to 1. Beit Hillel, 1 up to 8. And that's our custom today. So our custom today is to say the blessings, to have a candle called the shamash. Why the shamash? Because the lights of Hanukkah only refer to the Hanukkah celebration, so that you need another candle to light each of them. By the way, if one of your candles goes out, traditionally, you don't light it from another candle. You get your shamash back and you light it from the shamash. So there are 1 to 8 candles, and then of course the 9th candle. Most Chanukiot have a 9th place to put the shamash. So that's the historical dimension, and that is the ritual dimension. What's the symbolic dimension? Well, the symbolic dimension, I think, comes in four ways. One is how the oil, and this is where we might go for the miracle of the oil, how the oil refers to the courage and the resilience of the Maccabees and then everybody who resisted the Syrian Hellenists. The idea that there was, in the inner life, there was no courage, there was no resilience, there was only despair. Something happened where they, in my opinion, I don't think they could foresee a military victory. They just said, we have to fight. What happens in a person when they don't feel courage, when they feel helpless, when they feel defeated? Something happens within them where they have the resilience, the courage, the hope to continue the fight. So one thing that the holiday stands for, and this is simply looking at the history and the values embedded in the history, is the value of courage and resilience. At a deeper level, the fact that they rededicated the temple, the value there seems to be that the impure can be made pure. And this is a symbol more for us human beings. Many people walk around with a damaged sense of self. Some relationships have gone completely off the rails, and they don't feel that they can be repurified, that they can reset themselves, reset their relationship. So the statement of Hanukkah is that the impure can be made pure. Even if we don't have enough, we have enough, that we can find courage and resilience. So this is an example of the symbolic dimension where the history, the ritual are looked at, and we ask ourselves, what do these symbols actually mean? Now, in the Hasidic tradition, because we have the candle and the light, the Hasidic tradition, the tradition that comes out of the Baal Shem Tov, who lived from 1700 to about 1760, and created a movement of Jewish renewal and revival that continues until this very day. In the Hasidic tradition, and not only in the Hasidic tradition, but mostly in the Hasidic tradition, there's a focus on the metaphor of the ner, the candle, as it applies to the inner life. So they believe that deep within every human being, there's what you might call the holy oil, the essence, an organuz, a hidden light. We put a wick onto the hidden light, and that is called the mitzvah, or the action that we take. So there's a line in the Proverbs that says, ner mitzvah v'torah or. The ner is the action thing that you do to bring the oil from the hidden realms, the organuz, the hidden light, up into the top of the ner, the wick, you might say. But then we have to ignite the candle, and the teaching then is emitted. So for the Hasidim, this refers to the inner life of every human being, that we have a hidden essence, and we lose contact with that hidden essence. You can call it the soul, you can call it the authentic self, but every one of us knows some days you go through life and you realize you're just putting one foot in front of the other. Maybe you lost meaning, you've lost purpose, you lost faith, and you don't know how to get yourself back to a life of meaning and purpose. The Hasidim would say that your candle went out. The hidden light stays, but the light went out. And therefore, we have to remember every day to make sure that we have, as it were, a wick down into the inner essence, the inner oil, the inner light. And we have to light that with an act of will. That's the conscious igniting the light. And why don't people do it? And looking at my own life of many other people, they feel hopeless. They feel desolate. They're burdened down with sorrow, with depression, with regret, and they just don't think they can get out of it. What Hanukkah teaches is there's always an essence. There's always the hidden light. The light, the candle might go out, but the inner light is never exhausted. So the question is, how do you place a wick into that inner essence, and how do you place the light? The Hasidic tradition teaches it's a pure act of trust and will. We have to have actions in our lives that will light the ner and draw up the light of the soul. For me, mostly, that comes down to studying our text. Reading the Bible, reading poetry, reading Hasidic literature. So that's the transformative side. It's not just an appreciation of the symbols, but it's an actual practice rooted in transforming your inner life from an inner life of darkness to igniting the light and bringing enlightenment to the inner life, enlightenment to the soul. Last night, I focused on another text. I taught this text, by the way, at our congregational get-together back on December 3rd. And there's a really interesting teaching that adds to this. And the Sfat Emet is quoting the great Hasidic master, the Kedushat Levi, where he takes apart the word Chanukah. And he divides the word Chanukah into Chanu, Het Nun Vav, and Kaf He. Now, Kaf He by itself spells the Hebrew word ko. So it's Chanu ko. Now, what does ko mean in Hebrew? Ko in Hebrew means thus. So when you read in the Bible, thus saith the Lord, ko amar Hashem. So what he says is, what do you do on Chanukah? You study every place in the Bible where the word ko appears. You memorize that meaning. And then during Chanukah, you meditate on the verses that have the word ko. So I'll just give you two. It says here in Jeremiah 2:2. It says, Ko amar Adonai. So God says, Zacharti lach chesed nu'orayach. I've remembered the love of your youth. Ahavat klulotayach, the love of your nuptials. Lechtecha acharai bamidbar eretz lo zruah. You're following after me in a desert. A desert that had no food. So what is God saying here? I recognize the chesed, which means God's love for us, our love for God, and our willingness to follow God through a desolate place. So it says here, Ko Amar Hashem. By the way, I think I have the citation wrong. I think this is in Jeremiah 30s. So you can look up God, where God says, I remember the love of your nuptials, and you'll find the verse. Also in Jeremiah, this is in Jeremiah 22, it says, Ko Amar Adonai, thus says God, do what is just and right. Rescue from the defrauder the one who is robbed. Do not wrong the stranger, the fatherless, the widow. Commit no lawless act. Do not shed the blood of the innocent in this place. So in preparing for back in early December and for tonight, I went into my software and I looked up where the word ko appears in the Bible, especially Ko Amar Adonai. I looked at the different verses, including the two that I just mentioned to you, and I took the idea of a Kedushat Levi. Is one of the things that we do during Chanukah is we look up the verses that have the term Ko Amar Adonai, thus says the Lord. You memorize them, you study them, and you internalize them. So if ko has the sense of if the ka of Chanukah we read as ko, what is the chanu? The Kedushat Levi, feeling confident enough to break all the laws of Hebrew grammar, says that the word ko refers to the term chanoti, which means I grace you, I favored you. So Chanukah has a sense of God saying, I blessed you, I graced you with the word ko. Now this is a clear transformative practice. It has nothing to do with the history, nothing to do with the ritual. Symbolically, it's a stretch. But this is what the Hasidic tradition does. It looks at a word and it breaks the word apart, reassembles the word, for their interest in human transformation. So from this perspective, in addition to looking at the metaphor of the oil, that the impure can be made pure, that we don't have enough, we have enough of resilience and courage. The Kedushat Levi gives us a very specific spiritual practice, which is look every time in the Bible where it says, "Thus said the Lord." You can look that up. Look at the verse, study the verse. Kedushat Levi says, this is one of the ways that the more meditatively inclined celebrate Chanukah. All right, so to review, we reviewed the history of Chanukah. Your most important source is the Book of Maccabees. We reviewed the also in the Talmud, the fable of the oil. We've looked at the ritual of Chanukah. You can find that anywhere, the lighting of the Chanukah candles, the blessings and the songs. We looked at the symbol of Chanukah, and this is where the story of the candles actually is useful. The symbol of the oil that lasted 8 days, even though it wasn't supposed to. That's a pretty powerful symbol. The transformative practice of going inside, looking for your organuz, looking for your hidden light, and how to bring that light out into consciousness. And of course, we have this very interesting, clever teaching of the Kedushat Levi, where he takes the word ko, you look up the words, you look up the verses, you bring them into memory, and you use them as an object of meditation. So if you're watching this during Hanukkah, we wish all of you a Chanukah Sameach, a happy Hanukkah, that you enjoy studying the history, performing the rituals, examining the symbolic, metaphoric dimension, and also that this should be a transformative holiday for all of you. Chanukah Sameach.